My name's Eric, and I'm 28 years old. For as long as I can remember, I've been the punching bag in my own family. I was the quiet one, the awkward one, the broke one. Every family gathering was another reminder that I didn't fit into their perfect little hierarchy. My older brother, Jason, was the golden child. He could do no wrong. He was athletic, loud, and the kind of guy who filled a room with his voice whether you wanted him to or not. My younger sister, Megan, was the family's pride and joy. She was brilliant, hardworking, and in my mom's words, everything a daughter should be. Then there was me, Eric, the middle child who didn't shine in the same ways. My accomplishments never seemed to register. If I did something right, it was luck. If I failed, well, that was expected. The comments were subtle at first, the kind of digs you pretend don't matter when you're young. Don't expect much, Eric. Maybe you should aim lower, honey. Not everyone is meant to succeed. My mom had a special way of smiling while she said things like that, as though she were giving me life advice instead of slowly eroding my confidence. By the time I was in high school, Jason was already being scouted for college sports. Megan was stacking up awards, and I was invisible. I studied quietly, worked small jobs, and tried not to cause trouble. But to them, quiet meant weak, and small jobs meant failure. Fast forward to adulthood, and things didn't change much. My brother had a decent corporate job. My sister landed a cushy position thanks to my dad's connections. And me? They still thought I was the broke one. They never bothered to ask what I was actually doing with my life, never cared enough to scratch beneath the surface. And honestly, I let them think what they wanted. It was easier that way. That brings me to the party. It wasn't just any party. It was a big anniversary dinner for one of my mom's closest friends. Everyone was there, extended family, old neighbors, people I hadn't seen since childhood. I almost didn't go. I knew how it would play out. Me, tucked into a corner, ignored or ridiculed, while Jason held court and Megan beamed in the spotlight. But something in me told me to show up. Maybe curiosity, maybe something darker. The moment I walked through the door, I felt the shift. My mom spotted me from across the room, her lips tightening. She didn't even wait until I reached the table before she snapped, "Don't expect a real seat. You're just the broke one." My stomach clenched, but I forced myself to keep moving. Jason smirked, raising his glass. "Careful," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "He might try to pay with coupons." Laughter exploded around the table. I felt every chuckle like a knife to the chest. I wanted to disappear, to turn around and leave before the night unraveled the way it always did. But then I saw Megan's boss, a man I had never met, sitting 2 chairs away, scrolling on his phone. He glanced up at me, then back down, then froze. His thumb hovered over the screen. His eyes flicked back to me, widening as recognition spread across his face. He whispered something to his wife, who leaned in, curious. Then he kept staring. Not the kind of stare you give someone pitiful, but the kind of stare you give when you realize the person in front of you isn't who you thought they were. And just like that, the laughter died down. Conversations faltered. The clinking of glasses grew softer. I watched, my pulse quickening, as Megan's boss put his phone face down on the table, his jaw practically on the floor. The silence that followed was deafening. That was the moment I knew this night wasn't going to play out the way my family expected. The silence after Megan's boss looked at his phone didn't last long. Jason leaned back in his chair, smirking, clearly enjoying himself. He raised his glass again, breaking the tension. "Relax, everyone," he said, chuckling. "Eric's harmless. He probably just showed up for the free food." That got a few hesitant laughs, though they didn't ring as confidently as before. My mom seized the moment, waving her hand as if brushing away the awkwardness. "Oh, Jason, don't tease your brother. He can sit at the end with the kids' table if there's no room here." She wasn't joking. She gestured toward a small table tucked in the corner, where a few restless children were coloring on placemats. My cheeks burned, but I forced myself to sit down in the empty chair near the far side of the main table, ignoring her suggestion. That was the thing about my mom. Her digs were always delivered with the air of authority, as if she was setting order, not cutting me down. My dad sat quietly, sipping his wine, saying nothing as always. He was a man who preferred to stay out of conflict unless it directly involved him. That silence had cost me a lot growing up. Dinner began, and so did the small talk. Jason launched into stories about his new car lease. boasting about horsepower and features no one at the table cared about, but humored him anyway. Megan spoke about her big project at work, glossing over how she had only gotten the role because of my dad's introductions. My parents beamed with pride, their eyes shining with every word Jason and Megan spoke, hanging on like they were listening to celebrities at an interview. When the conversation briefly turned toward me, my mom jumped in before I could even open my mouth. "Eric's still figuring things out," she said, smiling tightly at the table. "You know, some people just need a little extra time. He's always been more simple." A few people chuckled softly, not knowing what else to do. My hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, but I swallowed it down. I was used to being cut off. Jason wasn't finished. "Hey, remember when Eric tried that business thing? What was it again, Mom? Selling. What was it? Discount gadgets or something?" He laughed before anyone answered. "Yeah, that didn't last long. Poor guy couldn't even get his website working." He leaned back, clearly proud of himself. The table laughed harder this time, emboldened by Jason's confidence. I glanced at Megan's boss. He hadn't taken his eyes off me since he'd looked at his phone. It was unsettling, but at the same time, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years: power. Still, the hits kept coming. When the server brought out the first course, my mom actually told him, "Make sure you don't bring Eric any of the wine pairings. He doesn't know the difference anyway." The server froze awkwardly, then nodded, setting a glass of water in front of me instead. My siblings laughed again, Megan covering her mouth as if she was being polite about it. Every time I tried to speak, the conversation would pivot back to Jason or Megan. My mom would interrupt with a reminder of some small mistake I had made years ago, like the time I missed curfew in high school or lost my wallet during a family trip. She had a bottomless well of harmless stories that painted me as careless or incompetent. I sat quietly, letting them build their narrative brick by brick, the same way they had all my life. But this time, something was different. The laughter wasn't quite as easy as before. A few people glanced uncomfortably in my direction, especially after Megan's boss leaned over to his wife and whispered something that made her eyebrows shoot up. Jason caught it, too, his smile faltering for the first time. "Everything okay, sir?" Jason asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Megan's boss didn't answer right away. He just looked at me again, almost like he was trying to confirm something. "I just realized," he said slowly, "I've heard your name before. Eric, right?" The table went quiet again. My mom, sensing the attention shifting, quickly cut in. Yes, that's Eric. He's our middle one. Always been a little different from the others. But we love him anyway." I clenched my jaw, biting back every word I wanted to throw at her. Because the truth was, I had worked harder than any of them ever knew. And if this night was headed where I thought it was, that truth was about to come crashing through their carefully constructed image of me. But instead of speaking, I stayed silent. Let them laugh. Let them think I was the fool at the table. Because the longer they underestimated me, the more devastating the moment would be when they finally realized who I really was. And as Megan's boss reached for his phone again, scrolling quickly with a look of disbelief, I could feel that moment drawing closer. Jason had this uncanny ability to sense when he was losing control of a room. It had happened maybe once or twice before in our lives, and each time he doubled down, louder, sharper, more cutting, to keep all eyes on him. So when Megan's boss leaned forward again, still looking at me with that strange, calculating expression, Jason's smile tightened. He wasn't about to let the spotlight slip from him to me. "Eric's name is out there all right," Jason said, laughing as he leaned back in his chair. "I mean, Google him if you want a good laugh. Probably some embarrassing old photo, or maybe that failed Kickstarter he tried years ago. Remember that one, Mom?" My mother chuckled, shaking her head. "Oh yes, he was so convinced it would work. He even borrowed money from us and never paid it back." She said it sweetly, like she was reminiscing, but it landed like a slap. The table laughed again, some nervously, some with genuine amusement. I felt my chest tighten. That money, they loved to bring it up, as if it were proof I was irresponsible. But the truth they never mentioned? I had repaid it tenfold, quietly slipping an envelope into my parents' account years later. They either never noticed or ignored it, preferring the story where I was the failure who owed them. I stayed silent, keeping my eyes on my plate. But then Jason's smirk curved into something crueler. He leaned forward, dropping his voice just enough to make it sound conspiratorial, yet loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. "Hey, Eric, he said. "Remember when you asked me to cover your rent that one time? Man, I almost forgot about that. Everyone, did you know Eric was practically homeless at one point? He begged me to help him out. Poor guy couldn't even afford a decent meal back then." The laughter this time was harsher, more pointed. A few guests looked down awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable, but no one said a word. My mom chuckled, covering her mouth with her napkin. "Jason, don't embarrass him," she said, though there was no real protest in her tone. She was enjoying it too. That was the moment. The betrayal. Because Jason wasn't just making fun of me. He was exposing something deeply personal, something I had confided in him during one of the hardest points of my life. I had been struggling after college, working 3 part-time jobs that barely paid the bills, and yes, I'd swallowed my pride once and asked my brother for help. He had agreed, smiling, patting me on the back like a supportive sibling, and then he weaponized it years later for laughs. I looked up, meeting his eyes. For a moment, the smirk faltered. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew he was twisting the knife. Megan jumped in too, piling on as if sensing blood in the water. "Honestly, Eric, you should be grateful. Jason has always been so generous with you. Not everyone would do that. You should have learned something from him instead of, well, whatever it is you've been doing." The table nodded in agreement, the kind of empty approval people give when they don't want to look too closely. But Megan's boss? He wasn't nodding. He wasn't laughing. He was still staring at me, his phone now fully out on the table, screen lit up. He wasn't whispering anymore. His wife leaned in, her eyes darting between me and the screen with a look of astonishment. Jason noticed. He frowned slightly. "What? What's so funny?" Megan's boss didn't answer right away. Instead, he tapped the screen, turned it slightly, and then looked back at me. "Eric," he said slowly, almost carefully, "is this you?" Every head at the table swiveled toward me. I didn't say a word. My heart pounded, my breath shallow. Jason laughed again, though it sounded forced this time. "What? Did you find some mugshot? Don't tell me he's been hiding some scandal." But as the boss held his phone tighter, his expression unreadable, I knew the tide was about to shift. For the first time in years, it wasn't me who felt exposed. It was them, my entire family, teetering on the edge of realizing that everything they thought they knew about me was a lie of their own making. The betrayal cut deep, but in that pain, I felt something else rising, something stronger, because this time, I wasn't going to let it slide. I sat there frozen, the laughter still echoing faintly around the table even though most of it had died down. My mom leaned into my dad with a little smirk, as if Jason's story was nothing more than a fond family anecdote to be filed away in her scrapbook of Eric failures. My chest felt tight, but I forced myself to stay composed. Inside, though, I could feel the betrayal gnawing at me. Jason taking one of my most vulnerable moments, one of the few times I'd ever trusted him, and turning it into his party trick. And the worst part? Everyone went along with it. That night, after the dinner finally wound down, I drove home in silence. The road blurred past me, the headlights of passing cars slicing through the fog of anger and humiliation clouding my head. When I got back to my apartment, I sat in the dark for hours, still in my suit, staring at the wall. I thought about every comment, every smirk, every time my mom had dismissed me with a laugh, every time Jason turned my mistakes into punchlines, every time Megan had been praised while I was brushed aside. And what hurt most was how normal it all felt to them. Like cruelty was just tradition at this point. For the next week, I felt myself unravel. I'd wake up with the memory of Jason's words ringing in my ears. He begged me to help him out. I'd replay my mom's voice. "He's always been more simple." I carried those words with me like weights strapped to my chest. Even when I tried to work, I couldn't concentrate. I skipped meals. I avoided calls. My life became this quiet haze of shame and frustration. And yet, in that silence, something started to stir. One morning, after a night of tossing and turning, I opened my laptop. I stared at the glowing screen for a long time, my reflection faintly visible in the black before it booted up. And when it did, I typed my own name into the search bar. The results filled the page instantly, dozens of articles, interviews, features, all the work I had poured my life into over the last several years, all the successes I had built quietly, far from my family's view. Reading them, seeing my name in headlines, the quotes where I'd spoken about resilience, about building something from nothing, it was like breathing again after drowning. The world knew who I was, even if my family didn't. Or maybe they chose not to. But as I stared at those results, another thought crept in. Why had Megan's boss reacted the way he did? Why had his jaw dropped when he saw my name? He knew. He knew something my family didn't. And the way he looked at me, it wasn't pity, it was respect. Maybe even fear. Still, I couldn't shake the pain. For days, I carried it like a shadow. I stopped answering my mom's texts, which were just passive-aggressive reminders about family loyalty and invitations to more dinners I had no intention of attending. I ignored Jason's calls, which I knew weren't concern, but rather curiosity about what Megan's boss had seen that night. Megan herself sent one short message. "Don't make things weird for me at work." That one hurt more than I expected. Not a word about how Jason humiliated me. Not even a question about whether I was okay. Just self-preservation, plain and simple. I realized then I couldn't rely on any of them. Not for love, not for support, not even for basic decency. So I pulled back. I stopped trying to prove myself. I stopped giving them chances to twist the knife. I started quietly building a plan, not of revenge yet, not exactly, but of distance. I began sorting through old records, organizing files, updating accounts. I dug through years of photos and messages, remembering every moment where I had been made the fool. It wasn't masochism, it was clarity. For the first time, I wasn't just suffering. I was cataloging. And somewhere in that process, I started to think. Maybe I didn't have to keep letting them write the story of who I was. Maybe I could rewrite it myself. But before I could even figure out how, the phone rang late one night. It was an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Eric?" a voice said cautiously. It was Megan's boss. I sat up straight. "Yes." There was a pause on the line, and then he said quietly, "We need to talk. Your family doesn't know who you are, but I do. And I think they're in for a shock." My stomach dropped. When I hung up the phone that night, I just sat there staring at the ceiling in disbelief. Megan's boss, someone I had never even spoken to before that dinner, wanted to talk to me privately. His tone wasn't mocking, it wasn't curious, it wasn't even casual. It was careful, respectful, almost cautious, like he had stumbled onto something far bigger than he expected. We met a few days later at a quiet cafe across town. He arrived in a sharp suit, the kind of attire that screamed authority, but his handshake was steady and genuine. "Eric," he said, nodding as if he'd been waiting to confirm I was real. "I have to admit, I was stunned at that dinner. I knew your work by reputation, but I didn't put two and two together until I saw your name." I stayed quiet, letting him talk. I'd learned long ago that silence often revealed more than words. "You've built something remarkable," he continued. "Your projects, the investments, the way you turn small startups into success stories, it's impressive. Honestly, I'm surprised your family doesn't shout it from the rooftops." I gave a small, humorless smile. "They prefer a different narrative." He shook his head, clearly baffled. "Well, let's just say if they had any idea who you really are, they'd treat you very differently." That conversation stuck with me. It wasn't just the validation, though I won't pretend that didn't feel good after years of being dismissed. It was the reminder that outside my family's narrow lens, I was someone. I had value, influence even. And in the weeks that followed, my life began to shift. Work picked up momentum in a way that felt almost surreal. One of the companies I had invested in hit a breakthrough, and suddenly my name was popping up in industry articles again. Invitations poured in, conferences, panels, interviews. My inbox overflowed with opportunities. It felt like everything I had been quietly building in the shadows was finally aligning, and I no longer felt the need to hide it. Financially, I was more secure than I had ever been. I upgraded to a larger apartment, one with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. Every morning, I'd make coffee and stand there, watching the sun rise over the glass towers, reminding myself how far I had come from those nights of eating instant noodles just to get by. And the strangest part? The less I reached out to my family, the more they seemed to notice my absence. My mom sent messages sprinkled with guilt. "You never come around anymore, Eric. Family is everything, you know." Jason called twice, leaving vague voicemails about how we should catch up sometime. Even Megan texted, though hers was sharp-edged, "Whatever you're doing, don't make it affect me at work." I ignored most of it, not out of spite, but because for once, I wasn't desperate for their approval. My silence was deliberate, powerful, and then came the subtle shifts. At networking events, I'd hear Jason's name mentioned. His reputation wasn't nearly as sterling as he pretended. Megan's projects at work? Turns out, They weren't as impressive when stripped of the family connections propping her up. For the first time, I could see the cracks in their carefully crafted images. They weren't invincible. They weren't untouchable. Meanwhile, mine was only growing stronger. The irony was that Megan's boss, after our meeting, became somewhat of an ally. He reached out occasionally, sharing insights or opportunities, sometimes even just checking in. The way he spoke to me was worlds apart from how my own family did, with respect, with seriousness. He treated me as a peer, not as some embarrassing afterthought. It was during one of those calls with him that a thought began to take shape in my mind. A dangerous, exhilarating thought. What if I stopped hiding my success? What if, instead of staying in the shadows, I let my family see the full picture? Not out of pride, not for applause, but to finally shatter the image they'd held of me my entire life. Because here's the thing, power isn't just about money or influence or recognition. It's about perception. And the moment their perception of me shifted, their entire world would tilt. I started to plan, quietly, carefully. Not revenge, not yet. But the setup, the rise before the fall. And as I stood one evening in my apartment, glass of wine in hand, looking out at the glittering skyline, I realized something I never thought I'd feel. I wasn't afraid of them anymore. The turning point came quietly, almost by accident. It was a Thursday evening, and I had just wrapped up a call with one of the founders I'd invested in. After hanging up, I noticed an email sitting in my inbox with a familiar name, Megan's boss. Subject line, "Thought you'd find this interesting." I opened it, and my pulse quickened. Attached was a copy of an internal report from Megan's company. Nothing illegal, nothing scandalous on the surface, but it told a story. The numbers didn't match the narrative Megan had been pushing at every family gathering. The big project she bragged about wasn't her brainchild at all. She'd been handed the pieces by others and was taking credit, inflating her role to appear more indispensable than she really was. I stared at the report, realizing immediately what it meant. Megan's success, the very thing my parents worshipped, wasn't built on her brilliance. It was smoke and mirrors, and her boss knew it. Maybe that's why he had reached out to me. Maybe he saw the same cracks I was beginning to see in my family's golden facade. That night, I pulled out an old notebook and began writing. Not venting, not journaling, planning. I started listing every instance of cruelty, every story they had told at my expense, every time they had cut me down. Alongside it, I wrote what I knew about them. Their weaknesses, their insecurities, their dependence on the image of superiority they held over me. Jason's entire reputation, for instance, rested on his supposed financial stability. But I knew the truth. He was leveraged to the teeth. He lived off credit cards, leased cars he couldn't really afford, and quietly borrowed from my parents when things got tight. To the outside world, he looked successful. To me, he looked fragile. My parents themselves were stretched thinner than they admitted. They had always acted like money was abundant, but years of funding Jason's and Megan's dreams had left them juggling debts behind the curtain. Their smugness at dinners, their insistence that I was the broke one. It was projection. And Megan? The report in my hands was proof that her career wasn't untouchable. Her image at work was carefully constructed, but all it would take was one spotlight in the wrong place to expose the truth. Piece by piece, I began to see the power dynamic shift. For years, they had convinced me I was powerless, worthless, the black sheep. But knowledge changes everything. And I was beginning to see that, armed with the right truths, I wasn't just capable of defending myself. I could dismantle the foundation of the little empire they'd built on my back. Around the same time, my professional life continued to climb. A quiet deal I had been working on finally closed, netting me far more than I'd ever dared to imagine when I started out years ago. My bank account reflected the reality my family still denied. I wasn't broke. I was thriving. And with each day, I grew less afraid of them finding out and more excited about the inevitability of it. Then came the invitation. It arrived in the form of a neatly worded text from my mother. Family dinner next weekend. Everyone will be there. It's important. Don't embarrass us by not showing. I almost laughed. The timing was perfect. They thought they were corralling me into another evening of humiliation, another stage for Jason's jokes and Megan's boasts. But to me, it looked like an opportunity, a stage of my own. I closed the notebook that night, setting it beside me on the desk. The plan wasn't finished, but the foundation was there. I had the knowledge, I had the position, and I had the means to finally, after years of swallowing my pride, show them exactly who I was. The only question left was how and when. The night of the family dinner, I walked in with the same quiet posture they'd always expected from me. My mom gave me a once-over, her eyes narrowing like she was checking for signs of failure. Jason was already at the table, loud and laughing, clapping backs as though he owned the room. Megan was dressed to impress, sitting close to her boss, clearly eager to show off her family for his benefit. I took my seat without protest, my expression calm. On the surface, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. The first course arrived, and right on schedule, Jason started in. "Glad you could make it, Eric," he said, raising his glass. "We were worried you'd skip out. Probably thought you couldn't afford the gas to get here." He laughed, and my parents chuckled obligingly. I didn't bite. I just smiled faintly and sipped my wine. Then Megan spoke up. "Honestly, Eric, it's nice you came. You've missed a lot of dinners. People might think you're avoiding us." She said it sweetly, but her boss, seated beside her, glanced my way with a subtle frown. He knew better. That was my opening. I leaned back, setting my glass down carefully. "I've been busy," I said evenly. "Some projects take up more time than family dinners." Jason scoffed. "Projects? What? Another one of your failed ideas. What's it this time? Selling coupons on the street?" Laughter rippled, but it was thinner this time. The memory of last time, of Megan's boss going silent, still hung in the air. I let the quiet stretch just long enough before I pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen, scrolling, then turned it to face the table. On it was a headline. My name. An article about a major acquisition I'd been part of, one that had circulated widely in the business world. Megan's boss went still, confirming what he already knew. My mom's eyes narrowed, trying to process. Jason leaned forward, squinting, before letting out a short laugh that didn't sound genuine. "Oh, come on. That's just luck. You probably just knew someone who knew someone." I tilted my head. Maybe. Or maybe I worked for years while everyone thought I was a failure. Maybe I built something real while you were all too busy mocking me to notice. Silence spread like a wave. For once, no one had a joke ready. But I wasn't done. I turned to Megan's boss, meeting his eyes. "Funny thing about perception," I said calmly. "People think they know who you are. Sometimes they're dead wrong." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips, and then, almost casually, he said, "Eric's right. In fact, his name came up in a boardroom meeting just last week. Impressive work. Rare to see someone build from nothing with that kind of vision." The effect was instant. Jason's smirk cracked. My mom's face drained of color. Megan stiffened, her fork clattering softly against her plate. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I just let the silence settle, the weight of their realization pressing down on the table. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the punchline. I was the one holding the cards. And the beauty of it was that I hadn't attacked them directly. I hadn't raised a single insult. All I'd done was shine a light and let their own shadows do the rest. Jason tried one last time to recover, chuckling weakly. "Well, good for you, little brother. Guess even you can get lucky once in a while." But no one laughed. Not this time. Because the balance had shifted. And we all knew it. The silence that followed Jason's weak attempt at humor was different than anything I had ever experienced in my family before. It wasn't the kind of silence that came after one of their cruel jokes at my expense. No, this was heavier. It was the sound of people realizing, all at once, that the narrative they had clung to for years had just collapsed in front of them. My mother shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her lips tightening like she wanted to speak, but couldn't find the right words. For the first time in my life, she didn't have a ready dismissal or a cutting remark. She just stared at me, searching for this simple son she thought she knew, and finding a stranger instead. My father cleared his throat and reached for his wine glass, but his hand trembled slightly. He was always the silent one, the man who let my mother and siblings take center stage, but now even his silence seemed shaky, fragile. Jason, on the other hand, wasn't ready to give up his throne. "All right, fine," he said, forcing a grin. "So you got lucky. Big deal. You think one headline changes everything? You're still the same kid who begged me for rent money." His voice was sharper now, desperate, like he was clinging to a lifeline. But Megan's boss cut in before I could respond. "Jason," he said flatly, "I've seen the numbers. I know what Eric's done. And if you had even half of his accomplishments, people would be talking about you, not him. Maybe instead of mocking, you should be taking notes." Jason's face flushed crimson. He opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. His confidence evaporated right there at the table. And then came Megan. She slammed her napkin onto the table, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. "This isn't fair," she snapped. "He's just trying to make us look bad. Eric, why now? Why come here and do this?" Her eyes darted to her boss, who was watching her with that same unreadable expression he'd worn at the last dinner. The panic on her face said it all. She knew her carefully crafted image at work was cracking, and she blamed me for shining the light on it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even lean forward. I just looked at her and said quietly, "I didn't do anything, Megan. I just stopped hiding." The words hung there, cutting sharper than any insult I could have thrown. My mom finally spoke, her voice low, almost pleading. "Eric, why didn't you tell us? Why keep this from your family?" I met her gaze and let every ounce of hurt I'd carried for years show in my eyes. "Because every time I tried to share anything, you turned it into a joke. You didn't want to see me succeed. You wanted me to stay the broke one, the simple one, the one who made Jason and Megan look good. So I stopped trying, and I built my life without you." Her face crumpled, the truth settling heavier than any denial could carry. My father stared into his wine, unable to look at me. The dinner limped on after that, but the dynamic had shattered. No more jokes, no more smug little digs. Jason sat in silence, his jaw clenched. Megan picked at her plate, her boss barely acknowledging her. My parents looked smaller than I had ever seen them. When the plates were cleared and people began to leave, I stood up, adjusting my jacket. For once, all eyes followed me, not with ridicule, not with pity, but with the weight of realization. I walked toward the door, pausing just long enough to glance back at the table. "You wanted me to be invisible," I said calmly, "but I'm not invisible anymore." And with that, I walked out, leaving them in the wreckage of their own making. That was the last family dinner I ever attended. Because the truth is, sometimes revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it isn't a dramatic speech or a final, crushing blow. Sometimes the most devastating revenge is simply standing in your own power, forcing those who mocked you to face the one thing they never prepared for, your success. And in that moment, as the door closed behind me, I realized something I had been waiting my whole life to feel. I had finally won.